Good morning, audience. Before we start, I want to give a big welcome to both of the professors, and I want to introduce Professor Matt Abrams. Is a passionate, collaborative, and innovative educator and coach. He teaches effective virtual communication and essentials of strategic communication at Stanford University's Graduate School of Business. Matt is also the founder and principal at Think First, Talk Smart LLC, a presentation and communication skills company based in Silicon Valley that helps people improve their presentation skills. Matt published the third edition of his book, Speaking Up Without Freaking Out, a book written to help the millions of people who want to improve their interpersonal skills and speak or present in a more confident and compelling way. In addition to hosting the Stanford GSB podcast called Think First, Talk Smart, Matt also curates nofreakingspeaking.com website. Welcome, Matt, to Shiv Nadar University Institution of Eminence. Thank you very much, Matt.
Thank
Next,
you.
I want to introduce Professor Paroma Chowdhury. She is a visiting professor at the School of Management and Entrepreneurship at Shiv Nadar University. She is an expert on reputation management, executive branding, crisis communication, and advocacy. Paroma is currently the Senior Vice President, Communication and Public Affairs at Byju's, India's largest edtech company. Prior to joining Byju's, she led communications for Asia at SoftBank Group International and was the director and country head, corporate communication and public affairs of Google India for more than 7 years. She has also worked at Bharti Airtel Limited, Hewlett Packard, GE Capital India, and the Indian School of Business in leadership roles. Before joining the field of corporate communication, she served as a business reporter and editor across Business Today, The Economic Times, and Business Standard. She has a press fellowship from the University of Cambridge and is an alumnus of Presidency College with a major in political science and international relations. Her interests include contemporary art, literature, and politics. She is an active participant in the Indian startup ecosystem and an ardent champion of free expression. So, without spending much time, I invite both the speakers to interact. And so, over to you, Professor Paruma.
Thanks very much, Rajesh, for that kind introduction. And Matt, thank you very much for being here. I know it's fairly late in PT. I've worked
Yes.
across multiple time zones, but really happy to have you here. And like Rajesh says, without much ado, let's just jump to the topic because everyone wants to hear about it. We are both communication professionals, so we know that how important communication is in running businesses. But I think in the last 2 years, it has become even more so because with the challenges of remote work during pandemic and distributed and dispersed employee groups, sometimes even distributed leadership, I think the communication could have been the glue which was holding people and organizations together or not together. So, in that sense, do you think it is strategic importance of leadership communication, particularly employee communication and also external, of course, has increased?
Well, first and foremost, thank you both for inviting me to be with you. And I am absolutely delighted to spend my evening with you all and to have this very meaningful discussion. And I'm very impressed with not only your students, but your university and both of your backgrounds. So clearly, communication is critical. And as the pandemic has shown us, that it is really the foundation for what holds organizations together. We have all realized how communication really drives a business. It is the way in which we organize, it's the way in which we execute. So, absolutely, I believe that communication has become very critical for everyone. And as you and I both know, as people who are practitioners as well as teachers of communication, that we've always believed this, and now others are seeing the reality that we've always been talking to. So, I find it very important that we continue to do what we do in terms of teaching and we enable our students and the leaders that we coach to really understand and hone their communication.
So what actually you think works. You teach communication at one of the world's
Mhm.
foremost institutions, and
Thank
I
you.
have also worked across a lot of large companies, both
Mhm.
multinational and Indian. And I have found in my diverse experience two companies I will cite where I have worked. One was General Electric, and the
Mhm.
other one was Google. At
Mhm.
GE, communication, like everything else that we do, was treated like a science.
Mhm.
It was metricized, it was tracked, and we had a timetable. We rigidly adhered to that, and it really worked well, particularly in internal comms. And Google, as such, as you know, it's a very inclusive company. So I can
Mhm.
give their example in almost all aspects of communication, how well we did there. In fact, the CEO's letter to the employees and the board, as communication leaders, we all had a glimpse at it and could suggest changes. That's quite an astonishing practice. I have not seen that anywhere else. So, in your vast experience, what are some of the things, some of tools, tactics, messages, what works? And if you could have some examples for our audience to learn from.
Certainly, happy to share. And one of my colleagues at the business school is Jeff Immelt, who you likely know from
Of
GE.
course.
He and I was fortunate enough to have him on my podcast, and we've talked a lot about communication and the approach GE took to communication and how important it was. And you're absolutely right; it was a priority from the top down. And I've done a lot of work with Google. I literally live 10 minutes from galactic headquarters for Google and do a lot of work there. And you're right, they definitely put an emphasis on inclusive communication and diversity in their communication. So when I look at organizations, I really look at three key aspects for setting up what I call a communication atmosphere that works. And it's really three parts. It's people, process, and infrastructure. You need to have each of those elements in alignment with the company goal and vision. And you need to have everybody assessing and working on that communication. So, for example, communication needs to be embedded within the onboarding process from the moment an employee is interviewed through the review process, as well as through the way in which companies work with their partners and customers and prospects. So an emphasis has to be put on that. So what does that look like? You asked for some specific examples. For example, as part of the interview process, and candidates should be asked about their communication skills. They should be given opportunities or perhaps tests and challenges to demonstrate their communication skills. When I was an operator running learning and development for several startup companies, we would have people practice and demonstrate their communication because it's a critical aspect of what we do. Beyond the hiring process, it needs to be part of the review cycle. I think everybody's performance plans and reviews should include how they communicate with each other, with their external audiences and constituencies. Several companies will actually assess and evaluate communication that I've consulted with, and we come up with a way of equipping participants with the skills that they need. So it's identifying the gaps and helping them develop them. So that's the people and process part. And then you need to have an infrastructure. So you need to have tools in place to help people. One of the benefits, I think, of the pandemic is that companies got organized around communication tools. Some have over-indexed on that and have multiple tools. And one of their challenges is how do we communicate and which channel do we use in which circumstance? But the infrastructure piece, which used to be in many companies inadequate or just barely sufficient, has now been made more robust. And what we have to do is center on best practices and ground rules for how and when and which tool we use. But it's all about really aligning the people, process, and infrastructure with the company's mission, vision, and values.
Yeah, that has actually brings me to the next topic pretty directly. So I always think that now we have a plethora of tools to choose from, as you rightly point
Yes.
out. And so, but companies are very different.
Mhm.
Organizations are in different life cycles. Particularly, I have worked for large companies as well as
Mhm.
large startups. Last
Hmm.
couple of years, I've been part of the startup ecosystem, and you have much younger employees there, and much very young founders, very enthusiastic.
Everybody's younger than I am, so
Yeah, and
I'm a
very young
dinosaur.
founders, very intense, energetic, and we also have very large companies which were mature, but they were
Hmm.
still dealing with the challenges of pandemic and dispersed employees. And now companies are again grappling with the challenge of getting people back to work,
Hmm.
or at least dealing with hybrid systems.
Hmm.
So I find it an interesting dilemma that there are organizations which want everybody sort of to sit in the same room or same location, and rely a great deal on in-person communication, whereas some very large multinationals have become completely digital. So, I mean, how do you make this hybrid work? What should be the tools that you are looking at and the practices you are looking at? I find this dilemma pretty interesting, that what to do. I mean, how best to do work in a hybrid world.
You're exactly right. It is a dilemma and it is a challenge, and one that is being figured out as we speak. And as you rightly mentioned, every organization is different. So I don't think that there are any one best practice that fits all. I think there are principles, though, that we need to be thinking about as we do this. And one of those is the notion of inclusion and equity. Diversity, equity, and inclusion is a huge issue, rightfully so, on my campus, in our country, and in the world, I hope. The challenge is, now that we're hybrid, we want to make sure that the technology does not reinforce inequities and work against inclusion. So we have to be thinking about best practices and procedures and policies to make sure that everybody feels like they have an opportunity. Many automatically think that those who are remote are at a disadvantage uh, the whole way through. And while there are disadvantages to being remote, things happen in the moment and in the room that are hard to replicate virtually. There's recent research just came out a few weeks ago that actually suggests that remote can actually uplift people who tend to be quiet or tend to be unseen, because they're put on the same level as everybody else. So again, being sensitive to the issue of inclusion and equity is important, and figuring out how to make sure people get included is critical. Additionally, you need to be looking at what, rather than looking at what is lost. I think it's important to think about, what are we trying to accomplish, and how can we accomplish that goal in a different modality or medium. So, if you think about employee onboarding, and at least the way it works here and the companies that I consult with and used to work for, you bring everybody together, you give them a t-shirt, you give them a backpack, you bring in people, you go out to lunch. I mean, but really what it's about is, it's about indoctrination, it's about welcoming, it's about connection. And there are ways to do some of that through virtual tools. And in fact, in some ways, you can do it even better and more directly. So part of what I think we have to do is really reflect on, what are the processes and the underlying goals of the communication interaction that we have, and are there ways that we can adapt and adjust a hybrid environment to accomplish those goals. It's going to look different, it's going to be different, but it doesn't mean that it's necessarily worse. And in some cases, I think it can be better. So the challenge is for all of us to really reflect on, what is it that we're trying to accomplish in the communication interaction, and how can we leverage the tool to help us do that. We're still we're building the plane as we're flying it. And as you well know, academic research often lags the reality on the ground. And so I think over the next 6 months or so, we will learn more about best practices and what works. A colleague of mine just today published in Nature a study talking about how hybrid work affects creativity. And we're going to see more and more work like that coming out.
Yeah. So let's jump to individuals from organizations.
Sure.
So
Yeah.
I'm sure a lot of people in the audience would like to know how to be effective communicators. And I think you're absolutely right. And I have also think, in my long experience, effective leaders are effective communicators. whether
Yes.
they're a natural or they are trained or they're usually a combination of both. One of the CEOs I worked with uh, made me write his intros to speeches about 15 times. Every time, he would change something. And there are people you give three talk points and who just go and kill it.
Yes.
So, I mean, there is absolute merit in preparation because I've seen the best speakers look like they wing it, but they actually don't. They really prep and work hard. I mean, this is something I've really learned, that there's nothing called winging it. So I mean, so it would be lovely to have tips from you as to how people can become more effective at speaking, presenting, which you do, as part of your work. So would be lovely to hear a little bit about that.
Certainly, certainly. So let me give some tried and true suggestions for how to improve communication. I know we're likely to talk about how to reduce anxiety and build confidence, so I'll leave that for that discussion when it comes. But you have to be in a place where you can focus and you can avoid distracting your audience. So addressing confidence issues is critical, and there's a lot of work that can be done there. But in terms of how to be a better communicator, there are really three foundational principles in terms of content. There's a lot I can say about how you present that content or what channel you choose. But it all boils down, I think, first and foremost to our job whenever we communicate is to be in service of our audience, whoever that audience is, prospects, customers, students. And really, most people start from the wrong place. They start from saying, here is what I want to say, which I believe is exactly the wrong place to start. It needs to be, what does the audience need to hear? So it's not about what you want, it's about what they need. So the very first step to become an effective communicator beyond managing your anxiety is to really understand who you're talking to. And that means you have to do some reconnaissance, reflection, and research. You need to know things like, what is their knowledge level? What are their expectations? What attitudes do they have? What resistance points? What motivates them? The list goes on and on. In one of my true pleasures and honors that I have is I host a podcast for the business school at Stanford, and all we do is focus on communication. And across 50 plus episodes, the most frequent advice experts in communication give is some version of know your audience. It's not about you, it's about them. So that's the very first place to start. And that's the biggest mistake people make. We all suffer from the curse of knowledge. We know too much about what we're speaking on. We need to put ourselves in the shoes of our audience so we can make our content accessible. The second step in that is, once you understand your audience, you have to have a clear, crystallized goal for what you're trying to say. And a goal to me has three parts: information, emotion, and action. What do you want your audience to know? How do you want them to feel? And what do you want them to do as a result of your message? I don't care if you're an individual contributor or if you are the executive CEO of a company. Every communication of high stakes needs to have a goal: know, feel, do. And that goal is predicated on what you understand about your audience. So you'll adjust it. If I'm talking to the board, I have to have a very different approach and message than if I'm sharing the same concepts with employees versus prospects and partners. So audience first, then a goal, know, feel, do. And then finally, the content has to be put in a structure. We have all suffered through people who just ramble on and on and on. And that's hard, that's burdensome and challenging. Structure makes life easier. So you have to figure out a structure that can work for your content. We process structured information much more fluently than we do unstructured information. Let me, if you'll allow me, I'll share my favorite structure. It's something I share with anybody and everybody who will listen to me. It is what, so what, now what? It is simply three questions that you answer. What is it you're talking about? This is your product, your idea, your belief, your answer, your feedback. So what is, why is it important? We have known for a long, long time that relevance is critical. If you're trying to get your audience's attention and focus, you have to make your message relevant to them. So what is all about the relevance. What does it mean for them? And then now what is what comes next? Is it another meeting? Is it signing on the dotted line? Is it watching a demonstration? If you can package your information in what, so what, now what, it makes it easier for your audience and it helps them. And ultimately, it will help you. So I encourage everybody to structure their content and try out what, so what, now what. Last thing I'll say, I know I'm talking too much, but I want to take a time out. We're going to have a meta moment, and I don't mean Facebook. I just explained structure using the what, so what, now what structure. I told you what it was, why it's important, encourage people to use it. It is a wonderful way for packaging up information. So bottom line, know your audience, have a goal, operationalize what you want to say in a structure. If you do that, you will be an effective communicator.
Yes, we often, used to call it the why, what, when, who.
That's another
Standard.
useful structure
Yeah,
for
yeah.
sure.
Just the
Absolutely.
structure. Why are you doing it? What you're doing, and who you are doing it for, and then when. What is the timing? So that's interesting. It's probably the same elements which sort of get put around as you structure your content. Very right. So the
Right.
next obvious question for many communicators or aspiring communicators, I would say,
Yes.
and students is how to manage anxiety. And this is a very big deal. You are making a presentation to your boss or your boss's boss or to your customers. Sometimes that sometimes addressing even large employee meetings,
hmm
when you, particularly when you have bad news to deliver.
hmm
uh, and there can be many scenarios like that, and where communication is not easy, and people are anxious, and even perfectly ordinary moments as well can make people very anxious because people are usually not used to public speaking. We don't have trainings in public speaking as part of our education and things like that. So this is something that I also face in my classes, and
hmm
also in real life, as to how to communicate better. And often we give examples of CEOs of the valley. Tim Cook, for instance, is
hmm
so effective at stonewalling. I mean, no matter what you say, he will actually stick to the message he wants to deliver. And if I may give another example of Jeff Bezos, who's such a hockey stick cowboy, because if you ask him about poor people practices at Amazon, which actually happened in a congressional hearing, and he just said, "Well, when I built my bookstore in the clouds," total deflection. So lots of people use tactics like these, etc., but you have to be accomplished communicators to do that. But so I'll break my question down in two parts. One is how to manage the anxiety first, and how to make better of it, and the later, what are some of the tools and tactics you can use to become better communicators.
Well, thank you for that. And I like how you worded the first part of the question, which is how can you manage anxiety? And that's exactly the mindset I want people to have. Anxiety is ubiquitous when it comes to communication. I believe there is a very strong evolutionary reason for that. It's hardwired into who we are. So, what we need to do is we need to learn how to manage it. The goal is not to overcome it, because I don't think we can. I think there is always a situation that can make us nervous. I've been studying this for decades and I still get nervous in certain circumstances. So, it's how to manage it so it doesn't manage us. When it comes to managing anxiety, we first have to realize it's not a light switch. It's not like you learn a technique and boom, all of your anxiety goes away. Would that not be nice? Rather, it's about hypothesis testing, using some very specific techniques to see if they work. And if they do, lean into them. And if they don't, find others. At the highest level, it's about addressing two things. One is symptoms, and the other is sources. The symptoms of anxiety are the physiological and psychological responses we have when we get nervous of communicating in front of others. It could be getting shaky, getting sweaty, it could be a dry mouth. All of this is normal and natural. It is your fight or flight response being activated. For very logical and evolutionary reasons, speaking in front of others is perceived as a threat, and our body responds in kind. And there are things you can do to manage symptoms. For example, taking a deep belly breath, the kind you would do if you do yoga or Tai Chi or Qigong, where you emphasize the exhale being longer than the inhale, can slow down your heart rate, can reduce some of the neurochemicals associated with being excited and in the fight or flight response. If you're somebody who gets shaky, doing big, broad gestures, allowing that adrenaline to dissipate can help. So there's specific things that you can do to mitigate the symptoms. In terms of sources, sources are the things that actually initiate and exacerbate your anxiety. So let me give you one example. Many people are made nervous because they are afraid of the potential future negative outcome of what they're doing. So your students might be worried they're not going to get a good grade, and that makes them nervous when they speak. The entrepreneurs you work with might be concerned that they're not going to get funding and they're not going to be able to do what they need to do for their business. That's a future concern. People who are employees in organizations might be afraid they're not going to get the support they need to further their projects. So what's making us nervous is the concern about something coming in the future. So how do we short circuit that? We become very present oriented. By definition, if you're in the present, in the moment, you're not worried about the future. So how do you do that? Well, you can do lots of things. You can do something physical, do some exercise, shake hands or talk to people if you're physically in the same room with them. You can do what athletes do, listen to a song or a playlist to get yourself in the present moment. I ask all of your students, the next time you present, do this. Right before you go on stage or right before you stand up in class, pick some number, like the number 100, and count backwards by 17s. It's hard to do. You have to be very present oriented to do it. So that's an example of a source and how you can manage that source. There are many other sources as well. For anybody who is nervous, I curate a website. It's called nofreakingspeaking.com. Lots of resources that I've researched and others. It's something you can manage. So the first part, the first answer to your question is you can manage anxiety. You have to do so by focusing both on symptoms and sources. Now, how do you get to be a better speaker? Really, it comes down to three things: repetition, reflection, and feedback. You have to practice. I bet you yourself and everybody listening at some point in their life either played a musical instrument or a sport or both. In music and in athletics, the way you get better is by practicing, by drilling. You also need to reflect. This is one of the big mistakes I think people make and organizations make. They don't build reflection into communication practices. All of us are so busy, we're just running from one communication to the next. And when I ask people, how do you define if you were successful in your communication or not? The biggest answer I get is, I got through it, as if survival is like the best way to measure success. So instead, you need to reflect and think, what worked? Did I achieve my goal? There's a definition of insanity that says insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting different results. That's how we communicate. So repetition, reflection, and finally feedback. And that's the value of what you and I teach. It gives people feedback based on academic research, so people know. So teachers, coaches, videos, books, those are all ways to solicit feedback. So how do you get better? You get better at communicating just like you get better at anything else: repetition, reflection, and feedback.
Yes, I think it's very, very true. And I can vouch for repetition. Some of the best speakers I have seen and known practice. Even if they are really accomplished, they practice. And they know their script, they rehearse their script. So that being that note perfect or tone perfect does not come easily. I
No.
mean, is takes years of practice and soliciting feedback, etc. So I would always, my advice is that really don't try to wing it. Practice, repeat, you're right, reflect, ask for feedback from smaller audiences. It could be family and friends if you have a big thing coming up, and it always helps. And I always give tips: dress comfortably, move around,
Yes.
speak in a strong tone of voice, don't mumble or don't shout. And a lot of TEDx videos personally have helped me as well. So there are tools like that. And which probably brings me to one of our last questions, and after that we will open it up. Is that, is there merit in spontaneity, or should communication always be planned?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, so I have spent the last many years of my life focusing on spontaneous communication. And if you think about it, the vast majority of our business communication is spontaneous. But I want to make a very clear point to the point you were just making. Just because something is spontaneous, like somebody asks you a question or asks you for feedback, or you're at a meal and somebody says, "Oh, you know this person, would you mind introducing?" Those happen all the time. That's spontaneous communication, but it does not mean you are not prepared. You can do a lot to prepare. Again, I'll use a sports analogy. Imagine you're playing football, soccer, and when you first learn, you do a lot of dribbling the ball around cones and shooting at the goal. Why? So when you're in the game, there are no cones in the game. There are people. But because you've done that practice of dribbling around the cones, when a person comes at you, you know you have the ability to control the ball. You know you have choices of what you can do. So the preparation you do helps you when you're in that spontaneous moment. So many people think spontaneous means unprepared, and that is not true. Spontaneous means absolutely prepared, but it doesn't mean scripted. So there's a difference. If you are a soccer player and you script, I'm going to kick the ball from here to here, and then that person's going to kick it from there, and that's never going to work, right? Because life gets in the way. But if you have prepared yourself to adjust and adapt and know your choices that you can make, then you can be very effective being spontaneous. So what I think is most critical is to develop both planned and prepared speaking as well as spontaneous speaking skills. The reality is, though, if there is any communication training in people's upbringing or companies, it virtually always focuses on the planned presenting. So we've got some relatively strong muscles around how to create slides and how to talk, but we don't have very strong muscles at all around how do you answer questions, how do you give feedback in the moment, how do you recover from a faux pas, what do you do when the technology doesn't work and you're up there and you can't go. What do you do when you show up to a meeting like this one, a Teams meeting, and it's just you and your executive there because you arrived early and that person asks you a question? I mean, those are the moments where we have to have strong, spontaneous speaking muscles. And that's what I've spent a lot of my last several years focusing on because there's a true deficit in it. So to me, it's not an either or question, it's a both. And they both rely on some of the same foundational principles.
Yeah, and I think it's very very important to work on the foundational principles and get them right. If you
Correct.
it's like using a sports analogy. If you have if strong muscles, you can run, you can lift, and
That's correct.
yeah. And if you don't, then you can't. It's as simple as that. So you can fall back upon. With that, I would like to open it up for
Mhm.
questions, and we have about 20 minutes, so we actually can take questions. Rajesh, however you want to do it, would you want us do you have pre-collected questions that you
Yeah,
want?
I request the audience to post the questions in the chat, and then I can draft it and can send to Professor Paroma for the discussion. I request audience please respond. Well, till the time they respond, Matt, I have a very genuine questions, and there are many undergraduate and graduate business students who are present today, and many of them actually are preparing for the job. I also did the same thing when I also prepared for the job interview in India. English is the primary way of communication in any business scenario. I mean, in an interview, it is predominantly English that people will communicate, but we are ethnically diverse. I mean that India is a huge country, and I think 90% of the population, they are the mother tongue is not English, so the English is their
Mhm.
second language. And many students, many graduate students in India, they're brilliant in their numerical abilities, but not so good in English because their upbringing was not from this kind of schools or college they are coming from. So I want your suggestions for these students when they are applying for the jobs. another 1 month or 2 months or 6 months down the line, how do they prepare? I mean, it's definitely preparations and practice is the key, but how do they prepare themselves so that they can more conveniently and comfortably speak to their future employer and get their desired opportunity as they deserve for?
Very important question, and our students are going through similar things as well. So when it comes to interviewing in your native language or in another language, I think what's really important is first and foremost, know your audience, do research, understand what the company does, understand what the company needs, think about how your skills fit in. I recommend everybody starts by identifying 3 or 4 key themes that you want to get across in your interview. It might be that you have technical merit that fits the requirements of the job. It might be that you are somebody who is very collaborative and open to feedback. Whatever, come up with 3 or 4 themes. And for each theme that you have, come up with evidence that supports it. And evidence can take 3 forms. Testimonials, that's a third-party voice. So you could say, my professor said I was the most flexible student they've ever seen. It could be data, where you could say I was in the 10th percent, top 10% of my class. It could be an example where you say in a particular project, here's what I did, here's an internship I had. So you create themes, and under each theme, you give concrete support that you have. And again, support is third-party voices, testimonials, it's data, and it's examples that you can give. This way, when you're in an interview and somebody asks a question, it becomes an activity of assembly rather than creation. So when somebody asks you a question, you immediately say, that question relates to this theme. And I know with that theme, I have these particular points and I can pull them in and use my example. And if you have a structure, much like what, so what, now what, or something else, then you have all the pieces you need. You have the structure, that's how you're going to say it. You have the inputs into what you're going to say within that structure. So all you have to do is assemble it. It's like getting a set of ingredients when you're going to cook and you have it all laid out in front of you. So all you have to do is assemble the ingredients together and you have an amazing meal. It is much harder to be on the spot having to figure out, how am I going to answer this question? What's an example I can use, etc. So it boils down to the pre-work. Now, if the language is a challenge, we here at Stanford, we have many students for whom English is not their first language, and many of them speak multiple languages. So it's not an unknown problem. 2 bits of advice. One is, don't try to be a native speaker. You'll never be a native speaker because you're not native. So instead of putting that pressure on yourself, rather just try to do the best you can. So we remove some of that pressure. A lot of non-native speakers want to sound like native speakers, and that's really hard and really intense. So allow yourself just to speak as well as you can. And then second, use a lot of repetition. So you might say something, but then give an example that supports what you just said. So if somebody doesn't understand some part of what you said, the story reinforces it and they go, oh, I got it. So you'll notice in all my answers that I've given, I repeat myself a lot. And part of that is to increase the likelihood that people will understand me. So I'll say the same thing in a different way, trying to reinforce the point. In fact, I just said the same thing 3 times. So you see how I do it. And that's very helpful for non-native speakers. So hopefully the planning, the themes, and the support, and then the assembly, and then taking some of the pressure off of yourself if you're a non-native speaker are helpful advice for your students. And I wish them all well as they enter the workforce or academe or wherever they're going.
In fact, Rajesh, I would add to that in specific
Please.
the context of India, where we have 21 state languages, as you know, which are recognized by the Constitution. And I mean, quite often I have actually asked, or even other people, that if you are, say, confident in Hindi, just say so and use your native language. It doesn't work everywhere, but Hindi is more or less spoken across India. And I've had come across candidates who have respectfully said that I really can't articulate myself so well in English at this point, and may I use Hindi to amplify? And it has worked beautifully. It won't work in all situations, but suppose you are actually giving an interview or doing something in a particular state, and if you are uh, proficient in that local language, if you use that, it actually can work very well. It
That's
often
great
works
advice.
well
Yeah.
in communication. So this is just an example I wanted to cite. And I suppose used to be these beauty contests, and all I have actually had an opportunity to uh, be in one of those training sessions,
Mm.
and and yes, and it was really interesting because the presenter, or actually the tutor, who was a very accomplished lady herself, was saying that this is going to be held in Tokyo, and I would encourage you to learn a few words of Japanese, so that if you are in top 10, you can actually address the audience in Japanese. I thought it was excellent advice. So, and this was a beauty contest preparation, okay? Not very politically correct, but just as an example, just to illustrate your,
It's a very memorable example for sure.
yeah. So just so we have a couple of really good questions. The first one is from the senior dean of the business school, Matt Vivek.
Uh-oh, I better get this one right. Okay, I'm
Yeah,
ready.
and who was a really a force behind making this happen, along with Rajesh. So Vivek asks, what are the ways in which educators can engage the audience better, educators
Ah,
themselves, and
yes,
and also, as because we are often there in a one to many situations, right? So, and
yes,
also a lot of virtual classes. So
yes.
how do educators engage their audience better, the students better?
Well, first and foremost, Vivek, thank you for the question, and thank you for helping support what we're doing right now. And I very much look forward to more collaborations in the future. The fact that you're answering the question, I think, speaks volumes for the type of education that you do in your business school. There are many places on this planet, not where I teach. I believe we are enlightened as you are, who feel like our job is just to push information out rather than thinking about what's the most effective way to help students learn. What we know is lots of bullet points on slides is not the way to do it. Our brains are not wired to take lists of information. I like to joke that bullets kill. Don't kill your audience with bullet points. Instead, think about relevance. The two major drivers of attention and retention are relevance and curiosity. If we as teachers can make our content relevant, now some of us have a much easier job of that than others. As a communication person, it's very easy for me to point out relevance of communication. Some of my colleagues who teach other subjects do not have that luxury, but still you can think about how to make it relevant, either in the short term or long term for our students. And second, engage people in with curiosity. Ask questions. What would it be like if, or what if you could, or what if this opposite thing were true? That engages people. Making sure that you give time for multiple voices. We know, for example, in virtual communication, if you don't change things up every 8 to 10 minutes, people check out. Our attention isn't long enough. It's hard to look at a screen for more than that. So you have to change things up. So maybe you ask a question, take a poll, use a whiteboard, show a video. So we have to think of our teaching as a way of engaging students. I was very, very fortunate as an undergraduate to study with amazing professors, but one in particular, some of your folks have heard of. His name is Philip Zimbardo. He's very, very famous for some very infamous reasons. There's a very famous study called the Stanford Prison Experiment. If you don't know about it, you should read about it. It is a foundational work in social psychology. He was a master teacher. And I talked to him a lot about his teaching and what he did. And he will tell you that you have to engage the audience. You have to give them practical applications, give them opportunities to process, to think, to engage. And he said something to me that I carry with me to this day, which is, it's not, as a teacher, it's not about getting through your material. It's about getting your material through to your students. And that's a very different perspective. If I see my job as a teacher is just to get through all the material in a set amount of time, then I'm just going to race through it and bullet points, etc. But if my goal is to get my material through to my students, then I have to make it relevant. I have to engage them through curiosity. So there is a lot that we can do, and I would love it if your institution, like my institution, helps teachers, gives them feedback. You know, it's very easy as an academic to just go into your classroom, shut the door, and do what you do. But if we give each other feedback and we share best practices, we all get better. So thank you, Vivek, for the question, and thank you for running an organization that prioritizes student learning and engagement.
Yeah, we have a second question from Kishore. Actually, Matt has already addressed this. So, but even if, since there's a question, maybe you can just recap, do a brief recap. So essentially, he's asking that how can we overcome the terror of being put in the spot sometimes? And it does happen to all of us that we suddenly get a topic. A student can get a topic in class. Let's say he cites that
Yes.
example. Or, I mean,
Yes.
as an executive, I can say I'm addressing an audience of employees and I get a really uncomfortable question. So,
Absolutely.
and or a journalist where I don't have an answer, really. So, what are some
And
of the things that we can do?
these are very real world issues. And in fact, I am doing a lot of work in this at this very moment on this topic. So first, realize you don't need to have all the answers in the moment. We put a lot of pressure on ourselves. It is okay to say, I don't know, and I'll get back to you. And if I have a hunch, I'll share that hunch with you. One of the things that is most self-defeating in these spontaneous speaking situations is the pressure we put on ourselves. I look to the field of improvisation, and if all of you have not looked into improvisation, it is fantastic and something I encourage you to think about. But in the world of improvisation, they have a saying: "Good enough is great." And I'm not advocating for mediocrity. That's not what I'm saying. But what I am saying is, when you strive for greatness and doing it right, you minimize the likelihood that you will do that because you put so much pressure on yourself. So when you are in that moment and the spotlight shines brightly on you, there are a few things you can do. One, you can buy yourself some time. You can buy yourself some time by paraphrasing. So if somebody asks a question, paraphrase the question. Paraphrasing is a lower order cognitive skill. You can actually be thinking while you're paraphrasing. You could return a question. So if somebody asks you a question or they ask you for feedback in the moment, you can ask a question back for clarification, buying you some time. So give yourself some time. Second, think about structure. Think about, how can I answer this question in a way that will be meaningful and structured? Because when you're put on the spot, you have two foundational tasks. You have to respond, what is it you're going to say? And then you also have to say it in a way. So how do you say it? What and how? So if you have a structure, you know the how. This is how I'm going to say it. So all you have to do is focus on 50% of the task. So knowing your structures well, that's like as was mentioned, that's like doing your exercises and getting strong. That way you can run, jump, etc. So knowing your structures. So take the pressure off of yourself. Know that there's some things you can do to buy yourself a little time, and then start with structure. And that's going to help you when you're in the spot. If you are interested in this, whoever the student was who asked the question, I have a talk where I talk exactly about this. If you go to YouTube and you type in "Think Fast, Talk Smart," you will see this talk. And I encourage you to listen, because this talk was created for Stanford Business School students. We found our students several years ago were really struggling with cold calling. A professor would say, "What do you think?" And these amazingly bright students could not respond, even though they knew the answer. So we created this program. I created this program that we delivered, and there's a video of this that was offered that's exactly on this point. How do you handle being on the spot, in the moment, responding? So long-winded answer. The answer is there are things you can do to help.
Yeah, no, this is very useful, I'm sure, to the student and to all of us. We have two more. I mean, we have a couple, but I'll take two
Sure.
really good questions, I think. So I don't think he's a student though, but when it comes to a mixed audience, like an AGM of a company, uh, how do we handle the multiple interests of the crowd, like investors, like journalists, like financial institutions? Uh, I will break this down a little bit. And if I may answer part of it,
Please, please.
yeah,
You are by all means an expert, more than I am. So
no, no,
please, I'd love to hear your answer.
but no, and I will ask it back to you. But for sometimes for journalists and for analysts, we are over prepared because we really, put a lot of thought and energy into doing a script, etc. And unless and until you have very thorny issues in your results or otherwise, usually these things tend to go well because they're planned. But at the same time, it can also go very awry. If you're doing an investor call in Japan, which I have done, people are really polite and respectful when they are asking even tricky questions. And but in the US or in India, again, I have attended calls, it could be very unruly. So two parts to the question. One is that what he's asking, it's a for a mixed audience, how you sort of tune your message. And 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 my question as a corollary is that if things start going wrong, and typically, this is a herd mentality. Somebody asks a tough question, then everybody follows up, right? So,
Mhm.
how do you handle mixed audience, and if things take a sudden turn?
Right. So with a mixed audience, you have to prioritize. You have to understand who is the most important for this particular communication and give priority to what's needed there. Uh, you can try to diffuse your content a little bit so it fits a more heterogeneous audience, but you don't want to dumb it down. You don't want to simplify. I don't think that's the right approach. You might want to call it what it is. You might say, in this room, we have people with diverse opinions and ideas and roles relative to this. Today, I'm here to talk about the folks who are implementing, or today, I'm really going to focus on what we need to be thinking about in making these strategic decisions. So you identify for the audience who you are focusing in on so they understand where they fit into this. So I think that just bolsters your credibility to call it what it is. So name what you see in front of you. So that's the first thing. If there is some scaffolding you can do to bring people to the level you need them to, then it's worth doing that. So you might say, we have a diversity of different roles and experiences in the room. And what we need to do is I'm going to spend the first 3 or 4 minutes giving some foundational background knowledge, and then we're going to talk about it at this level. That again helps build your credibility because you're demonstrating you're trying to bring everybody to the same level. But this is all predicated on the fact that you know this in advance, right? So that researching your audience is important. Now, the second part of your question is, what do you do when things don't go the way you want them to? Again, not part of what makes that worse and more likely is the pressure we put on ourselves to do it a certain way. Communication is organic, and it moves and meanders and focuses, and you have to have some flexibility in that. And if you have that flexibility, you can adjust and adapt. Being rigid, like we must get through this topic in this amount of time, only puts more pressure on you and on the other people and makes it more likely that you're going to have some of these problems. There is nothing wrong, one, with taking a break. If things are going really south, you can simply say, hey, I think we need to take a break and regroup. There's nothing wrong with turning it over to the audience if you have a good relationship with them, where you could say, look, we are really getting into this topic, but it's interfering with these other things we had planned to speak about. Let's take a poll. Do we want to continue doing this and forego that? So you can actually engage in some decision making in the moment. And if mistakes are made, you say something that's inappropriate or you get on a different track, apologizing is a good thing to do, is to say, look, this did not go the way I wanted. Here is what I had intended. I am sorry that we ended up in this here where we are, and here's the things I'm going to do to remedy it. So again, we put a lot of pressure on ourselves to do it right. And I am here to tell you, as somebody who's been doing this longer than I think anybody on this call, is there is no right way to do it. There is no right. There's better and worse, but there is no right. So putting pressure on ourselves to do it right is only working against us. So long-winded answer there, but I think I hit both questions.
Yeah, no, you certainly did. And we are running out of time, so I'll take just two questions and keep them short. One of them,
I will answer shortly, yes.
yeah, and it comes actually from one of my former students who
Oh,
was
great.
very, yeah, Sai Teja, who was very, engaged in class, and it was a pleasure to have him. So he is asking, during self-reflection, how to identify and evaluate non-quantifiable elements like intent, ethics, and moral values. It's a very interesting question, I thought. And how can we effectively communicate or incorporate these elements to manage organizational communication? But it's interesting. I mean, how do you identify and evaluate things like intent, ethics, and moral values in your audience?
So I just a podcast episode I did just a few weeks ago with some of my Stanford colleagues who wrote a new book on values and ethics in business. If I were to channel their answer, they would say, to begin, you really have to understand what your values and ethics are in the situations you find yourself. So you can't evaluate until you understand what they are and what's important. And then you also have to think about, what do they look like? So it's one thing to say, I value transparency. It's another thing to actually understand specific behaviors that you and others can enact to be transparent. And once you do that operationalization of your values and of your ethics, then you can actually quantify it. We are not our best judges of our own behavior and communication. So enlisting others to give us that feedback and help is really important as well. So I love the question. I think it's very insightful, and I'd love to hear that young students coming out of business school are thinking this way. It gives me hope. But I think first and foremost, it's reflection, understanding what your values are, thinking about what those look like or could look like for you and within your organization, and then figuring out ways to assess. And if you can do those things, I think you'll be in a good place.
Yeah, and he was great in class. Yes, I remember.
Great.
So, yeah, and another question from another student is that what's the best way to get feedback on how
Mm.
how I did or how I'm doing?
So I keep referring to this podcast I do, but I had the good fortune to interview some people who teach at Stanford's Design School, one of the world's most foremost creative institutions. And they're all about feedback. I mean, they're all about rapid prototyping and getting feedback. And the advice that their executive director shared about getting feedback is, one, be very specific when you ask for feedback. So it's not how'd I do, because that's a hard question to answer. So the answer is always going to be good or fine. Be specific. How did I do on the logic of my arguments? How did I start my presentation? Was it engaging? By being more specific, you will get more specific and detailed feedback. By making sure that you are open and receptive to the feedback you receive, uh, and be gracious when you receive that feedback, that will make it more likely. So it's really about being specific, being open, being gracious, and seeking out feedback from people you respect and trust. And that's the way you do it. That's the way you get feedback. I love the fact that the question is not should I get feedback, but it's how can I get good feedback. That's a great way to frame that.
I think we have run out of time, so I have the
Mhm.
privilege of asking the last question as the moderator. If we were to list just top three things for organizations, top three right things to do as to use communication for strategic importance and purpose, and for an individual, what is the top three things she or he would do to become an effective communicator? So top three for
Are you up for
business.
doing? Are you up for doing this collaboratively? I'll give one for organizations and two for individuals, and you can give two for organizations and one for individual,
All
because I
right.
I want people to understand that you are an expert in this, and I want to learn from you too. So, um, Well, I'll say one thing for organizations, and I'd love to hear your two, if you're comfortable with that, is prioritizing communication. In many organizations, communication is seen as a necessary evil rather than, even though you have comms people in organizations, communication, especially strategic communication, is critical. You must be communicating. Most companies, when there is a failure, when there's a crisis, you can trace some of the main issues to how things were communicated or not communicated. So from an organizational point of view, prioritize communication. And then I'll give the two for the individuals, and I'd like to hear your take on this. From an individual perspective, it's about recognizing that you can improve your communication. Many of us take a defeatist attitude, I'm just not good at this, or I'm an engineer, or I'm a scientist, which somehow absolves you from having to be a good communicator. I think it's exactly the opposite. So communication is something you can develop. It's something you can hone. I've been doing this work for decades, and I have seen thousands of people improve their communication. So number one is it's something you can work on. And number two, I said it already tonight or today, it's all about your audience. It's got to be about them. It's not about you. Make it relevant. Look into it from their perspective. I'd love to hear some best practices or top things that you suggest in both those categories, if you don't mind.
Yes, of course. I mean, I would love to, and I loved your answers. So for organizations, I would think, I mean, I would echo Matt, prioritize, because it is really important for employees to know what the organization is about, where it is going, even if it's not possible to share everything. Obviously, it isn't. And communication will need to be customized for the various audiences, even within an organization. But as a priority, I mean, please do communicate with your employees. It's the worst thing when employees know something from the newspaper rather than something from the CEO. And wherever I have worked, I've always pointed this out, that a major announcement needs to be preceded by a town hall or an email, because people need to know first. They shouldn't know from other external sources. And so prioritize and make it transparent to the extent possible. And my little advice to the communicators, like the tribes of us, is often I hear this, that, you know, communication doesn't really have a seat at the table. My simple answer to it: earn it. Nobody gives anything on a platter. If you earn it, you become a strategic advisor to the CEO and the leadership, and you can get many goals accomplished. So for communication,
Amen.
yes,
Amen.
exactly, on that seat. And for individuals, I mean, I would actually echo everything Mark said, that uh, three things rather. Get the content right. If you have good content, if you're informed, and if you know your audience, that's half the battle won. And then improve on your delivery, which is essentially practice. And I mean, I really encourage people to see videos of good speakers, things like TED, or the things that Mark is suggesting. Work on your delivery. That can really get better with practice. But if you don't have good content, then, you know, it's like a magic show. I mean, you just have delivery and you have no content, then it will not work. You know, you just can't do that. And also, if you have great content but you're a very poor speaker, that also wouldn't work. So the best communication comes from a combination of good content and good delivery, and also good intent. Thank you.
That is
Thank
wonderful advice.
thank you both, and so a very engaging discussion. And we have found, even though I committed Matt to get at least 100 students, but Matt, we got 60 people, and they were all round. I mean, they were from the beginning till end. So it looks that it's very engaging discussions, and it's quite night there. I'm sorry to bother you again, Matt. I'll keep in
No
touch.
worries.
And we are about to start a very hot day in Delhi. So it is going
Mm.
to be 45 degree, 44 degrees
Oh,
centigrade today.
oh,
So so you must be in a better location than
I'm
we
not
are.
going to tell you how nice it is going to be
I
here
know, I can
tomorrow,
imagine.
Yeah.
I can imagine. Thanks
but
very much, Matt, for your
thank
time.
you. I
I mean,
appreciate the
really,
opportunity,
yeah.
And all the best to you and your students, and your program is well regarded and well respected around the world, and all the best to all of you. Thank you, and have a good
Thank you.
day.
Thank you.
Stay
Thank you.
cool.